2 days before Rosh HaShana. And I'd like to talk about an aspect of Rosh Hashanah with a mashal, with an illustration, using a very powerful concept from social science. There was a great debate between two philosophers of science. One of them was the renowned Fri Apr. The other was a younger, much younger, Thomas Kuhn, each of whom wrote a very famous book. Apr was addressing a very serious question, the philosophy of science, which is, number one, how do you draw the line, or where do you draw the line, between science and non-science? What makes something scientific and what makes something non-scientific? Intuitively, we all would say chemistry is science, alchemy is non-science, astronomy is science, astrology is not science. But why is that exactly? How do you define science, and where is the dividing line between science and non-science? This is the problem of demarcation. How do you define the boundaries? Another problem that he also was dealing with is the famous problem of induction that was raised 20 years before by David Hume. The problem of induction works like this: that the type of reasoning that scientists use is called inductive reasoning. They generalize from their observations. So, for example, even ascertaining facts of science, let alone explanations, you can't examine every sample of a class. You only can examine certain members of the class. So how can you determine facts about the entire class of an animal species or a plant species or a chemical element? And the answer is we generalize. As you examine a sample, on that basis you assume that if this fact holds for the sample, it holds for the entire class. That's called inductive reasoning. It's a generalization. It goes beyond that which you observed. Okay, very powerful tool. Science is built on inductive reasoning. How do we know that it works? How do we know that induction works? Maybe it doesn't work. So the answer is we tried it a few times and it's worked, and therefore we can generalize and assume that it works.
That's circular law.
So how do you know that induction works? By using induction.
Yeah.
That's circular reasoning. In other words, if the whole technique is inductive reasoning, and how do we know that inductive reasoning works? When we've tried it, we see that it usually works. Therefore, we generalize it always works. That's proving that induction works by using induction. So that's circular reasoning.
If the experiment can be repeated by different people at different times, then it's a proof.
No, it's not a proof.
Well,
because in this one instance, it holds.
Not
I know that it always works.
Not one instance.
Let's say you replicate the experiment 1,000 times.
Well, then
You're assuming that it's true for the million of times that you haven't done the experiment, and it will hold for the future as well. How do you know that? It's a generalization, right? That's inductive reasoning.
So you could say the odds are it would be, right? But to say that
it's not proof,
right?
It might be a strong probability. So this is a famous question that was raised hundreds of years before, and Apr is addressing that. And Apr, very much like a lamdan, answered both problems with one yesod, one principle. He said like this. He said that scientists cannot prove anything, for the reason that we explained. They cannot prove anything. There's no such thing as scientists prove something. Because again, all their proofs are subject to the problem of induction. The only thing scientists can do is falsify their hypotheses. They can disprove their hypotheses. If a scientist proposes a theory, and now we have a bit of counter-evidence, that disproves it. So a scientist can never prove anything, only can disprove it. And the term he used is to falsify. He can never confirm his hypotheses. He can only falsify his hypotheses. So that's how he deals with the problem of induction, by saying, you're right. In other words, scientists never prove anything. All they do is attempt to falsify. What then is a good scientific theory? A good scientific theory is a theory which resists repeated attempts at falsification. If you try to falsify it again and again and again and again, and it always remains standing, it's like, who's the heavyweight champion of the world? The boxer, who everyone tries to knock out, and they can't. So he's the champion. So a theory is a good theory if we try again and again and again to falsify it and we can't. That means it's a good theory. That's what Apr said. Apr then goes on to explain that's what makes something scientific. Science makes claims that can be falsified. Science sticks its neck out. It makes certain claims about the world, and these are claims that can be falsified. Non-scientific pursuits make claims about the world which cannot be falsified. So, for example, is economics a science? Apr would say no. Because you go to an economist and you ask him, what can we do to stimulate the economy? And he says, if he's a Keynesian, he'll say, well, the government has to spend more money. We try that. The United States stimulus $787 billion. Nothing happens. It only gets worse. So it doesn't dawn on the economist that maybe his theory is wrong. He says, not enough money was spent, not in the right way. No, you never can pin him down. There's no evidence you could ever bring that will cause him to admit that his theory is wrong. He'll modify, he'll adjust, he'll sweep it under the rug. His claims do not lend themselves to falsification. I'll mention, by the way, that another area of endeavor which makes claims which don't lend themselves to falsification is religion. Let's say, for example, you believe as a matter of faith that God is good. What would have to happen to dissuade you of that? Is there anything that could dissuade you of that? Nothing. That's what it means to have faith. What it means to have faith is that your conviction is unshakable. Even the Holocaust wouldn't shake your faith. That means that your claim is a claim that can't be falsified. So it's not scientific. That doesn't mean that it's bad. This means that the nature of religion is that faith allows us to make claims which are unshakable. But this is why scientists think that they speak with greater authority. Because if they're willing to stick their neck out and allow themselves to be falsified, then when they aren't falsified, they feel this gives them greater credibility. Now, Apr goes on to say that this is what scientists do every day. When a scientist goes into his lab, he is constantly trying to falsify his hypotheses. He is running experiments again and again and again, not for the purpose of confirming, because that he can never do. It's for the purpose of falsifying. Because there is such a seeking of truth in the scientific community that when a scientist proposes a hypothesis, he subjects it again and again and again to critical analysis, always trying to undermine it, to defeat it, to destroy it. And he never rests. He's always trying again and again and again to falsify it. And only after repeated times does the scientist begin to think that maybe it's a good theory and can't be falsified.
This is strictly from the perspective of a philosopher.
Right, now, Apr was a philosopher of science, not a historian of science.
And not an
engineer. And Thomas Kuhn, professor of Stanford, somewhat younger, was a historian of science. And he said that this picture of what scientists do is a very, very romanticized picture. It doesn't relate to experience of the real world. So in reality, he says, members of the scientific community are as dogmatic as members of any faith community. And he coined a term which became very popular. I mean, he didn't invent the word, but he invented the word used in this way, which is called a paradigm. A paradigm is a way of thinking about something. That a community embraces a paradigm, a way of thinking, and the paradigm is never questioned. It's just assumed. It's taken for granted. And he says that every scientific community embraces a paradigm about its subject. So the community of chemists has a paradigm, we'll call it the atomic theory. That matter is made of molecules, atoms, electrons, protons, etc. This is given, it's accepted. You know, the biological community has a paradigm that it accepts evolution as the means by which species became differentiated. It's embraced without question. And he says, this is what is taught in elementary school, this is what's taught in high school, this is what's taught in university, this is what's written in the textbooks, and nobody who rejects the paradigm will ever get a position in a university. If you'd apply for a university teaching position and say, I'm a chemist, I don't believe in atomic theory, or I'm a biologist, I don't believe in evolution, see how far you'll get. Not too far at all. Because this is the accepted paradigm, this is the accepted way of looking at things. And it's accepted without question. So what do scientists do? Scientists solve puzzles within the paradigm. Within the general scheme, there are many unanswered questions.
But how is the paradigm created?
Well, the paradigm is created over time. We'll see how, when we see how a new paradigm replaces an old paradigm, we'll see how the first one got created to start off. We'll see in a moment. But generally, as long as the paradigm holds, all study, research, experimentation is carried out within the paradigm. There are problems. Problems of definition, sometimes detail work, but that's really what scientists do, and that's called normal science. Normal science. What happens when evidence begins to mount, showing that there is something very seriously flawed with the paradigm? It's usually swept under the rug. Sometimes the instrumentation is blamed. The technique of the experimenters is blamed. Sometimes it's just put aside as a curiosity to be dealt with at a later date. And it's usually ignored because there's too much at risk. We have this beautiful structure that we have a lot invested in. We're not going to give it up just because we have some little problems that don't seem to fit. But you know, just as in housekeeping, you only can sweep under the rug so much. You reach a point that it's not just a little dust. It begins to be a pile. The carpet no longer touches the floor. So it reaches the point that the old paradigm can't be defended with all the adjustments and all the modifications. And then a revolution takes place. A scientific revolution takes place. Usually the revolution is sparked by a person who has very little to lose. He's usually somebody very young, not a long-standing member of the community, doesn't hold a tenured position, and he'll publish a article or a book overturning the old paradigm and proposing the new one. There'll be a long period of instability when the two paradigms are competing for followers.
Where did you find the journal to publish the article?
Well, that's a big problem. It's a big problem. Often he'll have to publish privately. And ultimately, the community is won over by the new paradigm, and it replaces the old. Of course, the classic examples of scientific revolution are the Copernican revolution, which overturned the old Ptolemaic astronomy, in which it was believed that the Earth was the center of things, that everything revolved around the Earth. And he came to understand that the motions of the planets could not be explained within that paradigm, and therefore there must be a new paradigm in which the sun is at the center, and everything revolves around the sun. Now everything makes sense. So that's a scientific revolution. This idea of paradigm, and the paradigm being maintained, and the revolution, by the way, Kuhn's book, the name of his book is The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, is an idea which has been exported from the realm of science to every other realm of intellectual study. I've told this story in the past, maybe not in this class, but I'll repeat the story again because it illustrates the subject so beautifully. Years ago, when I lived in California, so I lived in San Diego, there was a college near our house, San Diego State University. There was another university, University of California at San Diego, which was a little farther away. But this was the local college, just a few blocks away from our house. And this college had a Jewish Studies department. The acting head of the Jewish Studies department was actually not a Jewish Studies professor. He was a professor of economics. He was the acting head. There was nobody who was crazy enough to run this department. And she was running it. And they used to sponsor a lecture series for the public. One of the things they did for the community. And they had a very small budget. And there weren't many Jewish scholars in San Diego. So it was necessary to fly people in, and it strained the budget. So if there was a local speaker who had something to offer, there was a lot of pressure to engage that person and save money. Now, just at this time, there was a professor in the other university, UC San Diego, who was a Bible scholar who had published the first popular book on biblical criticism, called Who Wrote the Bible? Now, you may know, if you go to a yeshiva, you ask someone in yeshiva who wrote the Chumash, who wrote the Torah, so you'll understand that the Torah is Minas Shemayim, was given by the Ribono Shel Olam, was dictated by God to Moshe Rabbeinu, he transcribed it, and so on and so forth. If you ask a university scholar who wrote the Bible, they'll tell you there's a documentary hypothesis. They really a composite of many different documents, and they were cobbled together by the unknown redactor, the unknown editor, R. And these documents are called E. Those are the documents where God's name is Elohim. There's J, where God's name is ve-chatima. There's P, the priestly code, which comprises much of the Yikra. And there's D, Deuteronomy, which really relates more to the way things are meant to be in Eretz Yisrael. So it's obviously a different document. Now, the truth is that the evidence that they bring to the hypothesis is not very compelling, at least in the way I see it. Because, for example, the fact that sometimes Hashem's name is Elohim and sometimes Hashem's name is ve-chatima in the Chumash is explained by Chazal. Chazal say that the Torah uses names within a context. God is referred to in accordance with his way of acting. When he acts with Midas Hadin, he's called Elohim. When he acts with Midas Harachamim, he's called ve-chatima. So we would expect that in certain instances the one name is used and the other name is used. And obviously, there are chapters in the Torah which are written for the desert, and there are chapters in the Torah that are written for Eretz Yisrael, because the Jews remained in the Midbar 40 years, but Sefer Devarim was said as the Jews were at the threshold of crossing into Eretz Yisrael. So obviously, some of the Parshias will be from a Midbar perspective, and some of the Parshias will be from a Eretz Yisrael perspective. So the differences in tone and mood between the various sections makes perfect sense. But this is their theory. And this is a theory which is considered scientific and has been embraced by the academic community. It never was explicated in a popular book until this professor, his name was Richard Elliott Friedman, came, and he wrote the first popular book. I think Random House published it, and this was for the masses, bringing the documentary hypothesis to the people. It was reviewed by Time magazine, and he became a little bit of a celebrity. He had his 15 minutes of fame. But it was just at the time I was living in San Diego, and this woman, who was the chairman of the Jewish Studies department in the other college, was under a lot of pressure to invite him to speak. He was a local celebrity. There'd be no major expenses involved. After all is said and done, he's become a national celebrity. Time magazine reviewed his book, and why not? It's a subject of Jewish interest. This woman was herself a religious woman. She didn't want to give a platform to a person who would essentially present a position which is kfira, a denial of Torah being divine in origin. So it was a big problem. She came up with an idea like this. She said that he'll speak, but she will ask someone to respond to his talk, and she asked me if I'm willing to do it. I said, it was my pleasure. I'm glad to do it. So she said, okay, she has to ask him. So she said, she went to ask him, and he said he's perfectly fine with having someone respond, with one condition. The respondent has to be a member of the academic community, which means it has to be a person who has a university position, it has to be a person who publishes in the same journal, and so on and so forth. In other words, it has to be a person who has bought into the paradigm. Now, she's willing to discuss problems within the paradigm. If they're going to debate whether E comes before P, or P comes before E, or whether this verse is from E or from J, those are the types of issues that he's willing to discuss in open forum. Is this document from the 3rd century BC? Is it from the 2nd century BC? Those are the types of issues he's willing to talk. But someone who's going to question the very paradigm, then he's not equipped to debate. Why is he not equipped to debate? Because it's assumed. And it's assumed to the extent that the people that bought into the paradigm often can't even defend it themselves. In other words, it's so assumed that you can't even imagine what it would be like to question it, and therefore you can't even defend it. So I mentioned this story because it really illustrates the point. You know, there's a community which has a certain paradigm. It's accustomed to thinking a certain way. The paradigm is never questioned, and therefore we are willing to discuss issues within the paradigm, but not to debate the paradigm itself. Anyway, just to finish the story, so I said, listen, if they're not going to let me respond, so I have to take the law into my own hands. So I had a kollel in San Diego. So I said, we're going to sponsor a program on the subject, who wrote the Bible. So I spoke to one of the members of the kollel, who now is a very distinguished Rav in Baltimore, and I told him, David, I want you to prepare a lecture on the subject, and we're going to bring the truth out. So he worked very hard, he prepared a very good lecture, and we scheduled it, we put up posters, publicity, and a crowd came to hear this lecture of who wrote the Bible from a Torah perspective. The night arrived, the big night arrived, and who's sitting in the audience? Rich Elliott Friedman Photo Vafno came to the lecture. I mean, after all, this is the guy who wrote the book and who wrote the Bible, so there's going to be a lecture in his hometown, in his home turf on the subject. He has to be there. So he came to the kollel for the lecture. So needless to say that the fellow who was giving the lecture was petrified. You know, he was recognizable because the local Jewish papers featured his picture many times, so we all knew what he looked like. As soon as he walked in, we knew who he was. And he said, I can't get to talk to you. David, you go in there, you can do it. And he went and gave the lecture. Anyway, so I stood there for moral support, just in case he didn't ask any questions, nothing. So I went over to him after, during the coffee hour. I went over to him, and I said, how do you do? I'm Breitowitz, Dr. Friedman, nice to meet you. How did you enjoy the lecture? So he enjoyed it very much. I said, I imagine this is not exactly your position on the subject, is it? I tackle this problem from the scientific perspective. This is from the religious perspective. No, I don't know exactly what that means. I mean, you're not talking about a value judgment. You're talking about a historical fact. How can there be two perspectives on it? What happened? What did happen? In any case, this was the story. But this is the idea. The idea is...
Question about this. I heard the story before, and I always come back to the same question about, is that a person who is a scientist, a lot of his work should revolve around research. Right? So we have 3,000 years or 2,000 years of examining these works, of great minds examining these works. The religious community, right? Why, when you read the books like this on biblical criticism, right, it seems as if nobody has read, what Rashi said on, what Rambam said on.
You made an interesting point.
Because what you've just said about Yud Kei Vav Kei and Elohim is not something that a great Talmud Chacham understands. It's something that somebody, in grade 9 understands.
Let me tell you two things. Number one,
and it's like they discard it.
Some very valuable work on this subject was done by a professor at Hebrew University named Professor Cassuto, Umberto Cassuto. He's a professor of Bible at Hebrew University, a very strong opponent of the documentary hypothesis, not a religious man, by the way. But he believed that a very strong case could be made for the internal consistency and unity of the Torah. And he wrote multi-volume commentaries on the Chumash based on this. But he wrote also a very, very concise refutation of the documentary hypothesis, very worthwhile to read, but in reality, again, it doesn't take much to refute it. In other words, the points he makes are very simple and straightforward, and certainly are ideas that can be understood by any high school student, was familiar with Tanakh. The issue over here is this. The issue over here is that there is this tendency in, I think, academia to assume that the people of the past don't have anything to tell us. We assume that the progress is so swift and so great that anybody who is 30 or 40 or 50 years old, older than we are, really has nothing to say. And in virtually every field of academic pursuit, researchers are reinventing the wheel. There's no point in looking back. Even in philosophy, it's very interesting, even though philosophy has a heritage of thousands of years, there's a very interesting little book written by a man named Mortimer Adler. He was a professor in the University of Chicago. So he wrote many books, very interesting books. One of them was called 10 Philosophical Mistakes. And the argument he makes is that much modern philosophy, when I say modern philosophy, I mean going back to the 1600s onward, much of the philosophy went off the track because it failed to address what earlier philosophers had written about these subjects exactly. In other words, Hume, Locke, Kant, etc. They addressed issues, problems, without making reference to what Aristotle, the scholastics, Aquinas, etc., had said on these very same issues. And had they given proper respect to the people that had addressed them in the past, they wouldn't have made these little errors which resulted in them going way off as a consequence.
But isn't that normative research?
But this happens. This is the common thing. This happens all the time. See, in the case of science, there's another issue over here. The issue is that if you speak to a scientist, and a scientist says, I'm looking for explanations. And this is a form of inductive reasoning called abductive reasoning. You're looking for the best explanation for something. So what is the best explanation for something? So a scientist will tell you that the best explanation is the scientific explanation. We are discounting any non-scientific explanations. So what is a non-scientific explanation? A non-scientific explanation is any explanation that resorts to a supernatural event or being. And therefore, those explanations we reject out of hand. Well, again, once you reject the best possible explanation, then the remaining best possible explanation is only second best. There's a built-in anti-religious bias because we are discounting the possibility of any spiritual, non-physical, supernatural being or event, and therefore we're left with only the possibility of explanations consistent with the laws of nature that we experience, and needless to say, that leads to some odd conclusions. But in any case, this is the idea. Why do I mention that in Rosh HaShana? I would like to make the following point, and maybe spending a half hour with the preliminaries will give it greater impact. Just like there are paradigms in biblical interpretation, there are paradigms in science, we each operate under a paradigm of how we look at ourselves. How we look at ourselves, our purpose in life, our abilities, our talents, etc., etc. There's a paradigm. There's a way of thinking, which we never question, or at least tend not to question. Now, the basic parameters of our lives, what we're all about, what our purpose is, what the meaning of our life is, what we are able to do. We have a certain way of thinking about ourselves. This is never questioned. So what do? We work within the paradigm. So I go to a few extra shiurim, and if I can come in late to shul, I try to come on time to shul, try to talk a little less in shul, which is all very nice. It's a very nice thing to make adjustments and modifications and improvements. But the basic paradigms, we tend not to question. So let's say you have a person who doesn't see himself as a serious Torah scholar. He sees himself as a person who, I'll go to an occasional class, a lecture, and so on and so forth. I'm not the type of person who's going to become an expert in Shas and in Jewish literature and Tanakh. And, I don't have the talent, I don't have the time, I don't have the interest. It's not going to happen. These assumptions, which are often poorly founded, tend not to be questioned. That's the reality. Meaning in the same way that the community of chemists operates within a certain paradigm, and everything they do has to be consistent with that paradigm, but the paradigm itself is never questioned. I mean, each and every one of us has a paradigm, a way we think of ourselves, which we tend to accept without questioning how it got started. I don't know, maybe it's the way we were raised, maybe it's what our parents told us about ourselves, maybe it's just the community in which we find ourselves. Whatever it is, but this paradigm exists. One of the terms that Kuhn used, besides the term scientific revolution, was paradigm shift. Paradigm shift is another way of saying the overturning of the old paradigm and the embrace of the new. And the paradigm shift is very unsettling. He explains, just as in a political revolution, when some group overthrows the government, there's a period of instability because the people are torn. Do we side with the ancient regime? Do we side with the rebels? There could be a moment of chaos, of civil disruption. Ultimately, it's resolved one way or the other. Either the revolution is suppressed or the revolutionaries become the establishment. But something is going to happen. But in the meantime, there is a period of instability. That's the very nature of what a paradigm shift is. Is we have to understand that Rosh HaShana is an auspicious time for a paradigm shift. It's the beginning of the new year. It's the time of taking stock, the time of self-assessment. And I think that it might be worthwhile to be bold enough to suggest that when we make this cheshbon hanefesh, it shouldn't just be to determine what adjustments I can make within the paradigm, but rather to actually question the most basic assumptions we have about ourselves and perhaps look at ourselves differently. For good. There's a famous Gemara. There's a Gemara in Rosh HaShana that talks about all the things that happened historically on Rosh HaShana. So one of the things it says is that Yosef was Yotza Mibeis Asurim. That Yosef, in the story in Chumash, he was released from prison on Rosh HaShana. And we'll notice some psukim that the Shir Shalayim, the Psalm we say on Thursday, mentions several things in close juxtaposition. It mentions the fact Tiku B'chai the Shofar, they blow the Shofar in Rosh Hashanah, and it mentions just a couple of verses later the miracle of Yosef, that he was liberated from prison, he went out and became the viceroy of Egypt, and so on and so forth. So from the juxtaposition, Chazal understand that Yosef was redeemed on Rosh Hashanah. What is the significance of that? So I once heard like this: we analyze the story of Yosef, you see an amazing thing. Because Yosef was, as a young boy, very, very blessed. He was raised in a very wealthy home. Yaakov Avinu was one of the wealthiest people in the world at the time. It was a house of privilege and honor. It was a house of piety and religious scholarship. Yosef had a special position. He was the Ben Zkunim. He was the favorite child of Yaakov. He was Yaakov Avinu's chavrusa. They studied together. That means Yosef had every imaginable advantage. Again, a wealthy family, a successful family, a religious family, a scholarly family. Everything a person could want, Yosef had. And then, all of a sudden, one day, he is sold by his brothers into slavery, and he's carried off to Egypt. And he faces a nisayon, he faces a test that is an unimaginably difficult test. Just imagine you're a 17-year-old boy, and you're in Egypt all alone, no family, no acquaintances, far from your parents. You're living in the mansion of this Egyptian dignitary, Egyptian minister, Potiphar, and the wife expresses interest in you. The opportunity exists. He certainly would get away with it, wouldn't get caught, and he resists. And Chazal say about this overcoming of the Yetzer Hara, the Gemara in Sota says that this is Yosef Kiddush Shem Shemayim B'Sefer. It was a Kiddush Hashem in secret. No one knew about it, but it was a Kiddush Hashem. Now let's put ourselves in Yosef's shoes. A person does such a great thing, such a Kiddush Hashem. Kiddush Hashem B'Sefer. Again, no support, no community, no acclaim, no one knows. But it's a tremendous Kiddush Hashem. Given Yosef's religious values, what should he have expected to happen as a result of this great deed?
Reward.
Some type of reward, they're a scholar. But what happens? She frames him up and accuses him publicly of trying to seduce her, and he's thrown in prison for 10 years. Because nowadays, when a Jew is thrown in prison, so they raise money for his defense fund, and they say kill him for his release, and so on and so forth. Then, no one knew.
Was it 10 years or was it indefinite when he was found?
Well, let's put it this way. He was there 10 years. He would have been released after 10 years, but it may have been an indefinite sentence. But he would have been released after 10 years. And then, after 10 years, something happens. He's in prison. And by the way, this prison, what do you think an Egyptian prison was like?
Terrible.
Now, it might have been...
Worse than a Turkish one.
It might have been a little better than average, because the Meshech Chacham understands it was a white-collar prison.
Oh.
Because the Pasuk says this is where the political prisoners were kept. But my guess is that even the political prisoners were not treated wonderfully in those days. And he's in this prison, and the Saramask and the Saraophim have dreams, and he interprets the dreams, and he tells the Saramaskium, put in a good word for me when you go to Paro. And what did Chazal say? What was God's reaction? He says, where's your bitachon? Where's your faith in God? Your faith in God. I mean, he's been in prison 10 years already. And God says, no faith? Another 2 years.
Did he realize the connection himself?
I don't know if he realized the connection, but he was in prison another 2 years. And it says in Svarim, Sefer Hasidus, it says that night, his last night in prison, that's when Yosef began to despair.
For any more he may afflict.
And he began to think, maybe I will be here the rest of my life. And the next morning, all of a sudden, they pull him out, they give him a haircut, they bathe him, they dress him, bring him to Pyro. After a very short conversation, which takes about 5 minutes to read in the Torah, they declare him as the smartest person in Egypt. They make him the viceroy of the land. They put a golden ornament around his neck. They parade him through the streets of the city on a chariot. He's Saftas Paneach. He's the one who reveals all secrets. He's the administrator of the food program in Egypt. He's the viceroy of the entire country. So what do Chazal say? Chazal say that was on Rosh HaShana. Rosh Hashanah is a day where such paradigm shifts can take place. That in a matter of moments, this person who begins to see himself as a prisoner, as a captive, as one who is condemned to the pit, whose life is hopeless and really, I guess you could say, meaningless, because what is the meaning of a life that's spent forever in prison?
Well, he did some good in prison because he interpreted the dreams for his fellow prisoners, and he was able to actually do chesed while in prison.
In the vast scheme of things, I guess you can make the most of a bad situation. But all of a sudden, everything turned over in Rosh HaShana. And the life that would have been very, very much diminished became a life that was of supreme importance to the entire world.
But that's an argument for passivity.
Pardon?
It's an argument for passivity. Just as Yosef quit, right? Yosef wasn't saying, my bitachon is greater.
I'm just saying this one thing that you see. You see that in Rosh Hashanah things can happen, and the reason they can happen is because there's no connection between the last day of one year and the first day of the next year. There's a new cheshbon, a new calculation, a new gzeir, a new decree, and things have the amazing, uncanny ability to change. And we have to think in those terms. That the fact that things have been a certain way up until this point doesn't mean they'll be this way after this point. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to begin questioning all the most basic assumptions of our lives. And Rosh Hashanah is an auspicious day to do that. And the problem is that Rosh Hashanah we're so busy. We're so busy with the machzer, so busy with the listening to the chazan, and so on and so forth, that we don't spend the time we should be spending in some real introspection, some real cheshbon hanefesh, to sort out what our lives are about. But I think that's what we really need to do Rosh Hashanah. And I think that if we really think about it for a second, we all can really do great things that we have been scared to do because we've told ourselves we can't, and we don't have the ability, we don't have the talent, we don't have the time, we don't have the motivation, etc. There's not to be that way. Because we can really, each and every one of us, achieve greatness. Now, greatness is not measured only by your public persona. Because even in very private roles, you can be great. You can be a great parent. You can be a great grandparent. You can be a great neighbor. You can be a great friend. You can be a great Jew. And sometimes we tend to dismiss this, because we think that greatness only is fame and fortune, both in the claim. And the truth is that even in the private things that we do, being spouses to our husbands and wives, being parents for our children, we can do a lot better. Even if you're a member of a shul, you can be a better member of the shul. You can be more active, more involved, take a leadership role. It might be drudge work. It may be working behind the scenes. It may be the type of thing that doesn't bring any acclaim or any but it has immense value, and it can be done. And if we're going to really change, if we're going to turn our lives into something that we can be proud of, I think this is the time we have to do it. This is the time which is auspicious for that. This is the time where there's a tremendous siyata d'shmaya for that. And I'll just end with a mashal. I heard a mashal once about slichas, really. And it's a very interesting thing that our custom for slichas really is not the authentic custom. Because we do slichas either fairly early in the evening, right after midnight, or we do it in the morning, already after sunrise, just perhaps a few minutes before when the regular davening would take place. But the real custom of slichas was to do it about 5 in the morning, when normal people would be sound asleep. It's only the people that are saying slichas are getting up. And it's an odd thing. What is the significance of our avodah taking place at a time that for the most part people are asleep? So the mashal goes like this. There once was a king who had a son. And, as often is the case, a person who is born into privilege likes to see how the other side lives. And he was very attracted by the peasant lifestyle. He was raised in a stuffy palace, and there was etiquette, and you have to use the right fork, and this type of thing. And he saw that the peasants lived a very earthy, a very vibrant lifestyle. So he began to live among the peasants, and he found this lifestyle very fulfilling. Well, after a while, he began to act like a peasant, think like a peasant. He essentially became a peasant. And it became a great embarrassment to the king. Whenever he'd come to visit the palace, he'd act like a peasant. He'd dress like a peasant. He'd eat like a peasant. And, this wasn't done in the palace. The palace was formal. There was an etiquette. There was a seder, and which he routinely violated. It was very embarrassing. Finally, they told him, listen, just don't come here. You're an embarrassment to the regime. Just stay in the village, and don't bother coming to the palace. Okay, it was a terrible source of distress, but what could he do? So he ended up living in the village. And one day he hears news that his father, the king, is celebrating the 25th anniversary of his coronation. And there's going to be a great ceremony and festivities in the palace. And the son is yearning to attend. He wants to attend. He wants to be with his father. So he makes his way to the palace, and he has to make his way through the security checkpoints. And they say, "Oh, him! Just go away. Don't bother coming in. You're an embarrassment. We don't need you here. Just go back to wherever you came from. We don't want to see you." And he's terribly hurt. This is his father. He wants to celebrate and join in with his father. So finally, he figures the only answer is he has to break into the palace. In the middle of the night, when everyone else is asleep, he'll find his way to an open window somewhere in the palace, and he'll find his way to the king's bedroom, and he'll speak to his father face to face. So, sure enough, he finds an open window, and he manages to climb up, and he enters the palace, and he makes his way through the corridors, and he finally finds the king's bedroom, and he knocks on the door, and he goes in, and the king wakes up, and lo and behold, it's his son, the peasant. And he falls on his knees and is crying and begging and says, "Father, Father," says, "you know how much I love you and how much I want to be involved in this celebration. The guards want to eliminate me because I'm an embarrassment. It's true, I understand I'm an embarrassment. He says, I act like a peasant, I live like a peasant. I've forgotten how it is to be a member of the royal court. So teach me so I can have a relationship with you. I can be a member of the party without causing embarrassment." So the nimshal is that that's the idea of slichas. When everyone else is asleep, we spend these precious minutes with our Father in heaven, and we lay the cards on the table, and we tell them, we're peasants. We understand it. We're peasants. We're embarrassments to the regime. So we want to be better. We want to connect with you, and that's why we come at night. We come at night, but night is the time where we can gain access. By day, There are too many obstacles. There are too many guards that are saying, don't come in, we don't want to see you. At night, in those hours when everyone else is asleep, this is perhaps when we can get entry into the king. That was the marshal and the nimshal. Now, I think the point is this, that when you live like a peasant, and you act like a peasant, and think like a peasant, you become a peasant. And once you're a peasant, it's very hard to think of yourself as a prince. I think this is the situation which we all find ourselves in. Whereas we see ourselves as peasants. Our expectations of ourselves are so meager and so low that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So Rosh HaShana is a time where we have to see ourselves as princes. It's a very interesting thing. There's a Gemara in Psachim that says that when we say Shema, so we say a verse which is not really written in the Chumash. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusol Yolam Va'ed is not really written in the Chumash. Where did it come from? Because even though Shema was said by Moshe Rabbeinu in the book of Devarim, that's not the first time it was said. When Yaakov Avinu was on his deathbed and he wanted to reveal Mashiach would come, and this information was denied him, so he suspected maybe one of his children was guilty of some sin, and that's why he can't reveal the case. So the children understood this suspicion, and they said, Shema Yisrael, listen, our Father Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, we believe God is one. In the same way that you believe God is one, we believe God is one, we are complete in our faith. And Yaakov was so overjoyed to hear this expression of faith from his children. He said the traditional response, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus Olam Va'ed, blessed is God's majesty forever and ever. Now, so the Talmud raises the question, what should we do? Should we not say the verse? Yaakov said it. Should we say the verse? Moshe didn't say it. So the compromise is we say it in a whisper. And so the rest of the Shema we say out loud, this one verse we say in a whisper. No, person reads that Gemara, you think the idea is that we have a problem here. We don't want to give the impression that this is written in the Torah, because it isn't. On the other hand, we don't want to leave it out, because Yaakov did say it. So the compromise, to show that it's different, is we say it in a whisper. That's what I would have said. But the Gemara says, what is this comparable to? There was once a princess who smelled psike kedera. The princess smelled junk food. That's the best way of putting it. The princess smelled junk food. Or she's going out with her entourage, and they pass by McDonald's, and she gets a whiff of the cheeseburgers and the fries, and she's just dying. She has to have a McDonald's. But what she can do, she's a princess after all. A princess can't eat that type of thing. So what should she do? Taimar, if she asks for it, yesh lo gedai. It's a humiliation. Al taimar, if she doesn't ask for it, yesh lo tsar. She'll have pain because she wants it very much. So what's the solution? Her servants began to bring it to her secretly. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm sure that when Bill Clinton was in the White House, the Secret Service had a regular run for him to McDonald's. Mm-hmm. You know, the President of the United States can't go out in the middle of the night to get a cheeseburger, but he said, no, you didn't even to say it. Go get it. Just hint to it, and they would run. What does that have to do with Baruch Shem? So Fri Apr makes something like this. He says that it's an amazing thing. Ribono Shel Olam is the king, the creator, master of the universe. What does he want? He wants that we should serve him, that we should acclaim his kingship. What are we in comparison to God? We're nothing. We're nothing. That God should want us to praise him is in a sense an embarrassment to God. That God gets his thrills out of our acclamation. This means something to him. It's a bizayon, it's a shameful thing. So therefore, on the one hand, he shouldn't even allow us to say this praise. That we should praise his glorious majesty. He shouldn't allow it, because our praising of His glorious majesty, what does it mean? Because imagine the king. He's a king. And he's the king of a province where the people are very uncultured, unwashed. And one day he's visited by the monarch of a neighboring country, and he takes his guest out to the countryside and said, "Look at my subjects. And they're filthy, they're illiterate, they're corrupt." I mean, what he's proud of? These are his subjects. What would he be proud of? So, on the one hand, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should have pleasure in our praise of Him is unimaginable. Really, to the contrary, it should be a gnai, it should be a shame. So therefore, God should say, "Listen, I don't want any praises from you. Don't serve me. Don't praise me. Don't bless me. No, I don't need it." But on the other hand, it'll be painful because He wants it so much. So therefore, we say it in a whisper. We say it in a whisper. But what really is the resolution? We know that once a year we don't say it in a whisper, which is Yom Kippur. Why is it? Because in Yom Kippur it's a little less of a shame. Because in Yom Kippur, when we raise ourselves to the level that we attain in Yom Kippur, which is like the level of Malachim, so then it's less of a shame for us to praise God, and therefore we can do it aloud. That's what we have to do. Because if we treat ourselves as being low, as being nothing, as being insignificant, so to the contrary, we are compounding God's shame. Because God, for better or for worse, sees us as His subjects. Right? If we are the flies, and God is the Lord of the flies, that's not saying much. Because if we make ourselves into vital people, into vibrant people, into accomplished people, so then it's a kvod shemayim, it's an honor for God that we should be His subjects, we should be His children. And that's really what it's all about. So it's a very, very challenging thing. And I'm not saying that we're going to have real revolutions necessarily. That takes a lot of boldness. But I think each and every one of us, in his own way, can aspire to greatness. And this is a good time to think in those terms. Don't just think of Rosh HaShana as a time for a little adjustment, a little change. As Rav once said, that tshuva is nicht besser werden. Tshuva does not mean simply to become better. Tshuva is anders werden. Tshuva means to become different. It means to really, really change. And that is a tall order. But as Hashem, Hashem should give us the insight and the ability to really think in these terms, and hopefully next year we will all be new and improved. Everyone should be blessed with a ksiva ve-chatima tova, a inscription and a seal for a very, very, very happy and sweet new year, a year of good health, a year of sustenance, a year of accomplishment, and of course a year of Shalom Yisrael, that the global problems that Klal Yisrael faces across the world should be solved, and in ways that are peaceful and allow Jews everywhere to achieve their loftiest aspirations.
Amen.